Are you so sick of being told what to do by your parents that you have become entirely opposed to the idea of any leader or authority giving you instructions or rules on what to do, regardless of how sensible or logical these instructions may be to your general well-being and safety? Are you a big fan of glowing, sparkly glass bottles? You see, very pretty. Oh, it's on fire, and now it's been hurled at a Tesla, resulting in a battery explosion, causing unimaginable damage to public property. Are you sick and tired of modernity and desperately just want to return to monkey, or just be whatever the frick this is? I guess exploring the seafloor for all eternity sounds more peaceful than raiding the McDonald's in a tracksuit and a balaclava. Well, if you answered yes to any of those questions, anarchy might just be the philosophy and way of life for you, although do be warned, it is way more complicated and unfortunately boring than looting a Foot Locker. So what actually is anarchy? Well, I'm sure if you've clicked on this video, you already have a rough idea of the definition. It's likely the first images that come to your head when the word anarchy pops up is more akin to this or this, and essentially just defines a bunch of skinny white kids in black protective clothing chucking about poorly made firebombs to protest against a particular governmental idea or a tragic event. And although that is technically correct in some sense, anarchy is a much more complicated and surprisingly subdued ideology when looking at the beliefs and history. So originally the term anarchy derived from the Greek word anarchia, which essentially just means having no ruler, which in turn means the ideology more so defines the rejection of any form of authority or leader within a society. Typically, anarchy favors a self-governing or community-driven society where no particular person is given any form of power over another due to political, governmental, or financial privileges. Whoa, and we interrupt this regularly scheduled Coolia programming to bring us a word from our sponsors, Fume. So if you're like me, you've developed many bad habits, cave dwelling, lurking, even smoking or vaping. But what if there's a way to just replace the habit? And that's where the sponsor of this video, Fume, comes in. Fume, the simple but enjoyable way to break bad habits. No nicotine, no vapor, just pure flavored air. Instead of choosing by your own will to breathe in dangerous chemicals for a buzz, you can just breathe in some natural, delicious flavors. And did I mention you can literally stim with it? You can stim with it. If you want to relieve stress or stay focused, just reach for your Fume and have a little bit of a stim. You know you want to. And did I mention it has countless flavors? My go-to flavor is crisp mint. It's super refreshing. It keeps me going throughout the entire day. But don't worry if you're not a fan of mint. There's plenty of other flavors that Fume has to offer. Over 500,000 people have already made the switch to Fume. For a limited time, you can order the Journey Pack using my code Coolia, and you'll get a free Fume topper, an awesome accessory to level up your Fume experience. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code on the screen right now to get yours today. And now let's get back to the video. In order to describe anarchy in a way that's far more simple for the typical mashed potato brained audience member that can't resist a thumbnail with a Wojak on it, I'm going to use the best example I can: monkeys. So imagine a typical family of monkeys. One of these monkeys has loads of bananas, loads more than any of the other monkeys, not to mention an impressive physique and massive monkey penis. Due to the monkey's haul of yellow fruit alongside physical dominance, he leads the monkey family and hands out bananas as he pleases to whoever he wants based on what they can give him in return. This entire monkey colony is reliant and at the whim of this one alpha monkey who has endless power over the rest of the tribe, not to mention a massive fucking hog. So this would more so define our modern society as opposed to what a typical anarchist aims to achieve, well apart from the big penis aspect. Let's now look at the anarchist's dream monkey colony. This family doesn't differ from the other in terms of physical traits. Each of the monkeys have different builds and penis sizes, although despite this, no one monkey becomes the leader of the tribe. In theory, they are all treated the exact same and either work together as a community to build rules to follow as a group, or each individual monkey picks a set of rules and laws that they choose to live by personally, trading and interacting with other monkeys as they please. The monkeys are tasked with sharing the bananas and working together to keep the community thriving, which on paper works, although these are greedy monkeys, maybe even cheeky monkeys. Greedy, cheeky monkeys who are able to freely set themselves their own rules without fear of a big cocky leader monkey laying down the goddamn hammer. This means things can get out of hand pretty quickly, and before you know it, monkey bodies are fucking flying everywhere, and not one banana is left for poor Mbeke. If we take this example, switch the monkeys to humans, swap the bananas for money and resources, scale up massively, and of course reduce cock size, you can begin to understand how anarchy could potentially work in a human society, and of course how it can fall apart very quickly, resulting in the negative connotation that automatically attaches itself to the term anarchy. Despite this being the common consensus, most anarchists that are educated and sensible don't just have an unrelenting urge to firebomb a McDonald's. Picture the ideal anarchist society as being one that runs from the bottom up, as opposed to top-down society that we are currently experiencing. By this I mean a society built on multiple self-governing entities that don't need to answer to any form of hierarchy. Essentially, everything runs itself independently from each other in regards to rules and regulations. If we are to actually define anarchy in a way that's fair to the original scholars, however, it's essentially the idea that no singular person, government, idea, or piece of bureaucracy is held in a higher regard than just the individual, which sounds like a beautiful way for society to run if we ignore all the intricacies and, of course, the state of the average human being's conscious. One aspect of our consciousness that's about as negative as it is positive is the way in which each of us think differently. We all have different ideas on how the world should be, what's right or wrong, whether you should listen to a music goblin talk about philosophy on a YouTube video with a Wojak. Everybody thinks distinctively. Different people have vastly different ideas on what is moral or not, and in an anarchist world, it's inevitable that one motherfucker will start doing something absolutely heinous on his computer that I will not repeat on this video, and without any form of established rules, he can freely do that, well, until another person finds out what he's doing, immediately becomes enraged, and can legally and freely delete that motherfucker from the face of the earth. I think you can probably sense an endless cycle here. So before we get a little bit too silly and piss off every political motherfucker in the comment section, let's actually explore the history of anarchy and make sense of whether this could actually work within a modern society, or whether we are just endlessly cooked, slowly trudging towards the event horizon where the world literally implodes in an incredibly comedic manner. If we are to look at anarchy entirely based on its original definition, it can very easily be argued that as a philosophy, anarchy has existed as far back as the origins of mankind itself, all the way back in prehistory, which does make a lot of sense. Nothing screams anarchy more than Grug smashing his wife's head in with a rock whilst absolutely tweaking off some mysterious mushrooms he picked up and stuffed down his ugly lips, thinking he's fighting literal God himself. Back before there was this dude or this thing, or you had the ability to do this, the earliest of humans primarily lived in self-sustaining communes without any real need for government or political leadership. Although the way in which our earliest ancestors lived is basically anarchy, it's difficult to actually define it as such, as anarchy is more so a reaction against the governing body or form of leadership, meaning it isn't suitable to be used to define a period in time where government literally just didn't exist. Instead, the cavemen of the time settled their disputes by loudly grunting around a fire and dying at the age of 35. In order to find anarchist ideas within a formal philosophy created in a society that actually had some resemblance of organization, we can go back to ancient China with the philosophy of Taoism. Taoism is based on the theory of Tao, which can be directly translated to many different words, although I feel the most important translations to this video are way or path. Although Tao is pretty difficult to definitively understand unless you literally have a gigabrain and can immediately make sense of 4 lines of Mandarin gibberish, it can pretty much be understood as the flow of the universe or the way things should be. It's essentially just the way things develop naturally, similar to how the later Stoics would shrug off their literal child being murdered. The Taoists separated themselves from desire and instead focused on the simple things such as nature or being quite literally Chinese. Although Taoism is far from a political theory, there are aspects from the many texts that comment on leadership, occasionally in extremely contrasting ways. Huang Lao, for example, justifies the need for a strong emperor as a ruler, whereas the arguably more iconic philosophers such as Lao Tzu and Zhang Zhao suggest what can be considered as modern-day anarchy. They rejected any form of political movement and instead just wanted to be one with nature, which I'd imagine just involved sitting around in a field and smoking copious amounts of opium. Although the early Taoists yapped about philosophies and ways of life that somewhat resemble classical or modern-day anarchy, anything physically resembling the term wouldn't begin to see usage until the ancient Greeks, which does make sense. The ancient Greeks were literally doing everything for the vine, including having sex with literal men, of course. So as we mentioned earlier, the term anarchy stems from the ancient Greek word anarchia, which essentially just means without a leader, meaning in turn we can find examples of anarchy within ancient Greek life and philosophy. Before Alexander the Great decided to unify Greece and rule like an absolute Chad, the empire primarily consisted of various isolated societies. This was due to the nature of the the location, bodies of water in between these various settlements made it very difficult for these small societies to connect in a way that is antithetical to typical anarchism. Despite this, each of these city-states or polis basically ran like a regular modern-day society, you know, a typical hierarchical society, that kind of shit. Despite this, in 411 BC there was a revolution of some sorts that somewhat reflected the anarchist revolutions that would occur centuries after the fall of ancient Greece, mainly by the French, but we'll get to that. This came off the back of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, which directly caused a financial crisis within the city. Before this point, democracy had existed within Athens for around 100 years, which contrasted the political system that was utilized in the rest of ancient Greece, primarily being oligarchies or tyrannies. Despite this, many of the leaders of Athens still came from extremely privileged positions, so kinda like modern day democracy, the illusion of choice but not really. This all became a big old stinky problem when the financial situation of the city only worsened, resulting in a group of upper class citizens attempting to form an oligarch of sorts in hopes to overthrow the government. Unfortunately, this did not work due to big old smelly Spartans putting a stop to it. Despite this not portraying anarchy in the modern sense, as the revolution didn't come from the working class, it portrays a similar situation to many of the events that occurred centuries after this point. If we are to explore the philosophy of the time as opposed to a bunch of Greeks getting pissed off and not being able to afford, we can see more clear-cut examples of anarchy, with many of the ideologies held by more modern anarchists being clearly seen by the Stoic and Cynic philosophers of the time. For example, the first usage of the word was seen in plays by Aeschylus and Sophocles in 500 BC, with many early Cynic philosophers supposedly presenting anarchist ideologies in many of their writings. Unfortunately, most of these writings are lost to time, so I don't even know how the f we know that. So let's move on. Fortunately, Cynicism heavily influenced Stoicism, with the founder of Stoicism, Zeno of Cittium, presenting a utopian society within his writings, a society that removes the need for structured leadership. He even attempted to disprove the idea that anarchy would lead to chaos, although essentially just yapped about the fact that nature itself provides instincts to humans that would prevent this. He's obviously never been to any UK pub in the summer past 10 PM. Socrates also questioned the idea of appointed leadership in many of his writings, and believed a government of any form was a danger to free will, and we all know how essential to life free will is. If free will didn't exist, videos like this wouldn't exist. There are plenty of examples of anarchism in between the fall of ancient Greeks, such as the entirety of the Middle Ages, and of course the Diggers, who were a group of dissidents who simply wanted to farm on common land and actually inspired much of the future hippie ideology, such as the 60s hippie group of the same name. Despite this, I think it's about time we get to the goddamn French, who essentially invented anarchy by being so incredibly French it literally makes my skin crawl. And speaking of French, I don't believe there is a period in history that is more French than the French Revolution. From bathtub-bound schizophrenics being able to cause revolutions without leaving the goddamn tub, to endless guillotine executions, to delusional monarchs who yapped about cake whilst having haircuts like this. The French Revolution had it all, including a prominent example of how anarchy can go kind of well and then immediately very, very, very wrong. By the time King Louis XVI had become king, France was in extreme amounts of debt, which wasn't helped by the habits of the nobility of the time. You see, the elites in France believed that the peasants or the lower class were put on this earth to do all the work, whilst they partied, whacked around, and acted extremely French. This worsened due to King Louis's weak nature. He basically let the nobility walk all over him, which led the peasants to question their position within society somewhat. So let's put this lightly. France was financially f***ed, and King Louis's wife, Marie Antoinette, wanted more luxury haircuts. So France did the only thing they saw fit to allow these haircuts to continue to take place: tax the poor. This obviously led to violence, with there being continuous fights between the peasants and tax collectors. I think you can probably guess what happened next. Mini revolts were happening all over the country. We just needed one tragic event to unite the French against the nobility, and this came in the form of various negative weather events that destroyed the harvest for the peasants. They had no goddamn bread, and I mean the slang term and the literal definition. The nobility had bread though. They had been stockpiling that goddamn wheat for years, so were unaffected by the tragedy once again. So at this point, the French peasants were not only poor and dissatisfied with the establishment, but also hungry as f***, immediately rioting in the streets. Obviously, the bakeries were targeted first, with bakers occasionally being hanged in the streets after the crowd suspected they may be keeping wheat and bread for themselves. Due to the absolute chaos within the country, the three states within France were given a vote on how to sort the problem, although once again the common consensus was to continue to tax the poor. This led to the formation of the National Assembly, who took the iconic tennis court oath to fight for equality and economic reform. More extremist parties would begin to form around the group, such as the Jacobin Party, who essentially wanted the king gone under any circumstance. Chaos would ensue, many heads would be placed on spikes, a bunch of French females would march towards the palace, which marked the first time in history Marie Antoinette laid eyes on a poor person, let them eat cake and all that. Although this event is most commonly known for the idiotic cake line sputtered out by Marie Antoinette, it actually led to the revolutionaries gaining a lot of power within France. King Louis was now actually face to face with the individuals that opposed him and pretty scared of them, so would commonly accept the demands which ranged from higher taxes for the rich to the banning of tax-funded parties. Louis obviously did not like this very much and attempted to flee the country. Obviously he was caught because he was the most recognizable individual within France. He then had his head sliced off epic style. Actually, a whole lot of people received that exact same treatment, regardless of whether they were on the side of the revolution or not. To rephrase that, there was a metric ton of guillotine executions, primarily because Jacobin Party leader Robespierre went pretty f***ing insane and was eventually guillotined himself after attempting to guillotine half of his own party, which led to a vote to just guillotine him in response. In the eyes of many, the death of Robespierre saw the end of the French Revolution, which is considered by many as by far the most violent revolution in history, mainly because of this dude and his guillotine addiction, I guess. Although I have ignorantly yapped about the French Revolution with a sprinkling of misinformation occasionally tossed in for a few minutes now, the prominence of the French Revolution in regards to its connection to anarchism focuses more so on the discussion surrounding the events as opposed to the actual events of the revolution. So it's quite clear the revolution can be considered anarchy in some sense, you know, the working class revolting against tyrannical leadership. Although whether the events and outcome can be considered positive to the idea of anarchy has seen much debate. It's clear that the revolution proves that the general population has the ability to overthrow any form of government, regardless of how powerful they may be. Although the events that occurred after the death of King Louis highlight one of the key negatives of anarchism. As soon as the revolutionaries were able to gain real power over France after the death of King Louis, it essentially led to the exact same situation but much more violent. Robespierre decided to literally execute anyone that opposed him in any way, resulted in severe bloodshed that somehow eclipsed what occurred under the rule of King Louis. The idea that any anarchist group will immediately become tyrannical if they have the ability to overthrow the government is still an issue that has not escaped the concept of anarchy as of yet, and seems to be more so deep-rooted in the forever cursed nature of the human psyche and what happens to everybody when they receive enough power. Although we've established the fact that anarchy has existed since the birth of man, with the French Revolution being a clear, concrete example, the French just simply weren't finished. They still had more anarchist ideology to cook up like some rotten snails, with the most prominent figure being Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. This French motherfucker with this beard is essentially considered the founder of anarchy. This is due to the book What is Property? Within the writings, Proudhon describes the concept of anarchy as the absence of a master, and goes on in other writings to claim any individual who seeks to lead him as an enemy, as well as highlighting in detail every way an organized government could take advantage of your freedoms by essentially listing every single word that is spat out by Alex Jones on a daily basis as soon as he wakes up. Proudhon's most prominent addition to the concept of anarchy would be mutualism, an economic theory that encourages control for the worker as opposed to the business owner. In a mutualistic society, each individual worker is self-managed, and the idea of profit is absolutely disgusting for anyone who supports mutualism, which doesn't make much sense considering most of the motherfuckers who support this theory spend the vast majority of their time in pretentious coffee shops typing away on overpriced Apple laptops, but I digress. So far, every example of anarchism I have referenced within this video essentially just defines the political liberation of the lower class, with these events being defined as classical anarchism and continuing for a good few centuries. A prominent example is once again, unfortunately, the French. In 1871, another group of revolutionaries were able to take power of Paris and hold control of the city for about 2 months, where they promoted progressive anarchist policies such as self-policing, the abolishment of child labour, and no more rent. This came off of the back of a war with Prussia, a war that the French lost convincingly, resulting in the upper class population of of France fleeing, leaving just the working and lower classes. The leader at the time witnessed the unwashed rat-munching French and feared a revolution, so moved a bunch of cannons into the streets. Unfortunately, these soldiers were stopped by a group of women, and instead of opening fire on these women, they opened fire on their commanding officers and took over the city. This surprisingly went pretty well and actually presented a situation where anarchy worked pretty effectively, well, for about 2 months, until pretty much every one of the revolutionaries was slaughtered in an event aptly named the Bloody Week, which only really stopped when there was so much blood in the streets it was beginning to flood the sewer systems. This was obviously inevitable as the revolutionaries were clearly outgunned, although for a small period of time anarchy actually did kind of work, mainly due to the fact that the individuals involved were on the same page in terms of how they wanted to run the city, although who knows what would have occurred if it wasn't for the Bloody Week, and if the commune was to last for a little bit longer. Would it just evolve into chaos? We don't really know. A similar event occurred in Italy in 1919 named Biennio Rosso. The aftermath of World War I had caused a financial crisis, and once again the country was cursed with an extremely corrupt government who cared more about lining their own pockets than the people struggling within the lower class. A network of anarcho-socialists began getting to work, quickly taking over land, organising food production, transportation and defence. Their most prominent action was seizing the factories, which allowed them to set up autonomous communes, making the factories far more productive due to better pay and less stinky bosses. Unfortunately, much like
most examples
of anarchy within history, each and every one of them were killed. Although anarchists somewhat played a role in many of the civil wars throughout the world, it would be one particular civil war that saw the end of classical anarchism, with the theory and philosophy losing prominence until motherfuckers with spiky hair began showing up a few decades later. This would be the Spanish Civil War. The situations within Spain that led to the Spanish Civil War pretty much mirror each of the situations we've explored in this video. The country was run by a corrupt monarchy, propped up by the Christian church, which is fine. It's not great, but it's fine. It only really becomes an issue when the country becomes completely and utterly and it turns out we do in fact live on this bitch of an earth, and we do live in a society, so it's inevitable each and every country will enter a period where it's completely and utterly This time there was a huge wealth discrepancy between the upper and lower class, alongside political disagreements on how the country should be run. Fortunately for the working class, rapid industrialization caused by World War I gave more power to the workers, which was a population that had doubled in size in the 20 years or so prior. This allowed for a group of people that were strong and large enough to actually make a difference and fight back against the establishment. War would inevitably break out when Francisco Franco, alongside his nationalist group, formed a coup against the more anarchism-focused Republicans. This civil war is notorious for being one of the most violent wars in the history of Europe, although it does portray situations where anarchy can work effectively. This is because the Republicans took control of various areas of Spain throughout the war and were able to effectively introduce the philosophy of anarchy. Barcelona was a key example of this, where traditional government was abolished and instead goods were distributed based on need within worker-run collectives and communes. Unfortunately, tensions between the two opposing political groups began to worsen, with the anarchist communes being pushed back and replaced with more traditional governmental structures, which resulted in Franco eventually winning the war and ruling over Spain until his death in 1975. The Spanish Civil War is incredibly important when exploring the concept of anarchy, as there were points during the conflict where the philosophy actually worked, although it can be argued that the only reason for this is because they eventually lost, as many argue that any group that comes into power is inevitably going to become corrupt, like in the case of the French Revolution. So we're at a point in the video where I am going to have to issue a small trigger warning due to the contents of the next section. I understand this might be scary to a huge section of my fan base, but there is going to be a woman on the screen. I know, it will be okay. So let me hand this section over to an individual who may actually know what they're talking about.
In the USA in the 1940s to 1960s, the radical pacifist movement was a place for social democrats and anarchists alike. It was a safe haven for them when anarchy seemed to be on its last legs, and marked a crucial point for anarcho-pacifism. Anarcho-pacifism is a subcategory of the anarchist movements, which basically just rejects using violence to achieve social change, much to the influence of Proudhon and Tolstoy. As many Americans will tell you, during the Cold War era, you were either a very good, very kind, good American citizen or an evil communist. There wasn't really any regard to any third alternative or a middle ground, and that is where the beats came into play. Beats were people who used art or spoken word to get their ideas across, and they were often accused of being communists and outcasted by society just because they didn't agree with the American ways, when in reality they were basically just speaking up about the corrupt government on both sides. Without these beats, there would be no hippies in the 60s. Without these beats and the hippies, there would be no punk.
So far throughout this video, anarchy has essentially been defined as a working class that revolts against a corrupt government, which does make some sense based on the definition alone, but contrasts the modern representation of anarchy, Molotov cocktails, violence, and flying Starbucks cups. That is because the definition and common understanding of anarchy would change drastically, moving away from a nuanced philosophy and more towards a state of mind. So what caused this? Well, I believe it can be explained by countercultural subcultures that began in the 60s and how they are viewed within the mainstream. Of course, we can immediately look towards the hippies. They were essentially just anarchists without any of the violence or cool aspects. They simply rejected mainstream ideals and instead wanted to live in self-sustaining communes, with many of them actually partaking in this to some success. Then each of the communes turned into cults, and hippie culture died as soon as the fashion industry realized how easy it was to make and sell tie-dye t-shirts, like the fashion industry does to everything that is cool ever. Punk then reared its greasy, rotten head in the 70s, and although they rejected and essentially hated hippies, they shared a lot of the inherent ideologies, although differed tremendously in the fact that punks got absolutely no bitches and hippies got way too many bitches. The earliest of the punks within the UK quickly adopted the idea of anarchy. This can clearly be seen with the Sex Pistols and their song Anarchy in the UK, which rejected the idea of the monarchy and of course Queen Lizzie, the adrenochrome addict. The only difference between the Pistols and the revolutionaries within the various civil wars throughout history is that the UK was in nowhere near as bad of a state as these other countries, and instead of actually fighting against the system through violence or a revolt, the Pistols just made shit music and sold a ton of overly edgy clothing. If we are to look towards punk music that actually promoted the ideals of anarchy, it is probably best to look towards the subgenre of anarcho-punk, with the most prominent band within this scene being of course Crass. Whilst the Pistols were living a life of relative luxury, which involved taking a ton of budge as well as crashing and burning musically, Crass were actually living the life they described within their music, a life that actually correlated with the ideals of anarchy. This can clearly be seen with the funding of the Wapping Autonomy Centre or Anarchist Centre in 1980, which became not only a self-sustaining squat commune for individuals within the anarcho-punk scene, but a location to plan protests against the meat industry or whoever may be in power at that particular time. This inspired various other self-sustaining squat communes within the UK, with Crass being the most prominent band within the scene that continuously echoed the ideals of anarchy. The group would even form out of an anarchist commune and very quickly began doing some pretty insane shit in regards to their live performances. They decided to play under extremely bright lighting, so bright it's very difficult to actually find Crass live sets in the modern day that aren't face-meltingly bright. They also pioneered various aspects of the modern day concert, including multimedia video presentations within the backgrounds of shows. Although Crass were a band that consistently put out influential and quality music, their main focus wasn't on creating music per se. They more so wanted to push forwards the ideals of anarchy and fight against the negative reputation it was beginning to receive, regularly handing out flyers at shows explaining the actual ideology of anarchy and how it can be applied to modern day society, attempting to fight against the negative reputation. So how exactly did anarchy receive such a negative reputation? It seems the common representation of anarchy in the modern day reflects chaos and violence as opposed to a political ideology that historically encourages more rights to the classes that make up the vast majority of the population. Well, if we actually look at the history, anarchy perhaps had a worse connotation than it does today. For example, during the French Revolution, many French authors and politicians used the term to denounce the sheer chaos that was caused by the French Revolution, which Which is fair, to be honest. That entire period in history can be defined by a motherfucker in a bath getting increasingly pissed at some bitch that won't stop eating cake, resulting in pretty much everybody, regardless of political opinion, getting guillotined. So it isn't exactly the greatest example of anarchy. In reality, anarchy has always linked itself towards violence, and of course, events that contain extreme violence stick out and are far more iconic than situations in the past that reflect peaceful anarchist communes. There's a reason the hippies in the 60s don't immediately connote anarchist, whilst the punks of the 70s do. The punks are loud, brash, over the top, and suggest a baseline level of violence or chaos, whilst the hippies are just rich, privileged, and bored, which to be fair reflects the modern day Western anarchist quite nicely. Whilst we're on the topic of punks and their connection to anarchy, I think it's only fair we dip our toes across the pond and explore an example of a band out of the United States that also reflected more modern anarchist sensibilities, the Dead Kennedys. The Dead Kennedys would form in 1978 and very quickly began to draw attention based on their name alone. If you're somehow unaware, the band's name refers to President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1963. Although the name suggests that the band are poking fun at the event, that is actually far from the truth. The name stems from the political and cultural consequences of JFK's death. In the eyes of many, it sparked the end of counterculture in America and put a stop to a wave of change, therefore killing the American dream. These motherfuckers went full-on Hunter S. Thompson. Although punk was always anti-authoritarian and highly political, no band presented these ideas quite like the Dead Kennedys. Everything was so absurd and over the top, with Jello Biafra's signature cadence being combined with fast-paced punk instrumentation and lyricism that reflected sarcasm and humor more effectively than a ginger whining about holidays in the sun. It's much better listening to a whiny singing about holidays in Cambodia instead. The Kennedys never intended to be rebellious in the traditional sense, and didn't reflect the modern day definition of anarchy that strays more towards chaos and violence. And although their shows at times were chaotic and violent, the way in which they presented their music felt more like an interrogation than a protest or riot. An interrogation against the American dream and status quo that had remained present in American culture throughout the Summer of Love, and even through the rise of punk and hardcore. Bands like Crass and Dead Kennedys arguably pushed the idea of anarchy much further in the modern day than the more iconic artists such as the Sex Pistols, as they were able to practice what they preached far more than a bunch of fashionistas yapping about the Queen. They inspired anarchy as an aesthetic into the modern day, which can be seen by many as somewhat negative. This may suggest why anarchy is perhaps as prominent today as it has ever been, with most Western countries seeing a higher prominence of individuals with anarchist ideas than ever before. This is, of course, the more nuanced ideology of anarchy, as opposed to literal chimpanzees throwing shit at each other outside the local supermarket, although that does happen sometimes. Another reason for its prominence in the modern day, apart from Zoomers having too much time on their hands, is the free flow of information caused by the internet. Although this concept is seen as positive in many ways, as it allows for the human race to be smarter collectively, although much more stupid individually, in terms of politics it can be seen as a negative. It's almost impossible to avoid politics regardless of your hobbies or where you may reside on the internet. This in turn pushes people to more extremist and alternative political viewpoints, with anarchy perhaps being the exact opposite of the system most Western countries employ in the modern day, therefore being incredibly popular. It's clear that regardless of a country's political situation, there will always be two opposing sides, meaning it will always be prevalent within counterculture to some degree. The issue with anarchy in the modern day is the fact that it is so politically and ideologically split. You can easily find anarchists that present primarily Marxist ideas, and then find anarchists that fundamentally hate any idea of communism, capitalism, or really any political idea, because it might mean they get told what to do at some point. It makes it incredibly difficult to take anarchy seriously as a political force, which does make sense when exploring examples of anarchy throughout history. Most uprisings have resulted in extreme violence, either due to the revolting force coming into power and becoming the very thing they sought to destroy, or pesky capitalists sticking their nose in, or more accurately slaughtering any anarchist they find on the streets. It's clear anarchy can work in smaller scenarios, although I find it hard to picture a world in which anarchy would be successful within a large-scale society, mainly due to the nature of human beings. Human beings can be evil, they can naturally disagree with each other, they can hold different ideals and standards, and most importantly, human beings can be incredibly stupid. And no example of modern anarchism presents this more than the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone was a self-sustaining anarchist commune that would form in 2020 off of the backdrop of prominent BLM protests swarming all across America. Essentially, if again you're not aware of this incredibly prominent event. This future brain surgeon was brutally murdered at the hands of the police, which of course is not good at all, and sparked worldwide outrage, resulting in mass-scale protests, with the end goal of the movement differing depending on the protester. Many wanted to end police brutality and racism through reform. Some wanted to abolish police altogether, and others wanted to form an entirely self-sustaining anarchist commune within Seattle, despite barely having experience feeding themselves in the way that isn't entirely goyslop. After a short battle between the police and protesters within a section of Seattle, the protesters would somehow come out victorious. Well, mainly because the police just decided to stand down, but a win is a win, I suppose. This prompted the protesters to immediately set up a self-sustaining anarchist commune within the city, separate from the rest of the United States. They immediately got to work setting up barricades, aka borders, placing guards around these borders, aka immigration control, and setting up areas within the zone that were only accessible by particular races, aka racism. Although this may seem like an authoritarian society run by anarchists, you would be a right-wing chud for having that opinion, because of course, there wasn't just one leader, everyone was equal. Well, that was until a random SoundCloud rapper waltzed in and immediately became dictator of CHAZ. Due to the weakness of leadership within CHAZ, a SoundCloud rapper named Raz Simone randomly walked into the commune with a gun and a few of his friends and immediately became the leader. He was essentially a dictator, randomly assaulting people, setting up armed police forces, and attempting to profit off of the zone. Simone led the commune with an iron fist, leading to one of these many assaults, forcing the residents of the zone to call the Seattle police. I think you can imagine the response. Despite Raz Simone's intense aura, his rule over CHAZ was bound to come to an end, with the power being returned to the protesters. This signified a change. They decided to change the name of the zone to CHOP, Capitol Hill Organized Protest. There was just one problem. There was literally no organization. Not one of the individuals involved could agree on where they wanted to take CHOP politically. With the food harvest being, let's say, less than optimal, CHOP quickly devolved into chaos. Muggings were frequent, individuals would randomly sucker punch each other, and worst of all, shootings became commonplace. The first prominent shooting ended tragically after the protesters formed a human chain to prevent ambulances and police from entering the scene and attempting to treat the teenager who was in critical condition. You see, CHAZ didn't need traditional ambulances. They could treat the teenager themselves in their own CHAZ hospital. Yeah, the teenager tragically bled out around 20 minutes later. A day later, there was another shooting resulting in minor injury, and another similar shooting the day after that. Very quickly, the world began watching CHAZ, and it was essentially presenting every single bad thing that can happen when a society starts utilizing anarchy without a plan. The day that would finally put an end to CHAZ would occur on the 29th of June 2020. The CHAZ security were notified of a stolen Jeep and immediately sprung into action. They quickly found the Jeep doing donuts within the zone and for some reason suspected that the thrill riders were racist chud shooters and immediately opened fire. The Jeep attempted to escape but couldn't get past all the blockades and borders built around the zone. When the CHAZ security eventually caught up to the Jeep, they immediately shot and killed a 16-year-old black child. This teenager was unarmed and harmless and simply just wanted a joyride. The world looked on in disgust and the police immediately got involved, dismantling the zone, cleaning up the feces and shit left by the residents and returning the area back to normality, which was actually incredibly easy apparently. I don't know why they didn't just do it sooner. If we ignore all the humour, irony and of course tragedy that plagued the short lifespan of CHAZ, we can use it as a case study to explain why anarchy in the traditional sense just wouldn't work in a modern day society, primarily because people are just stupid. Unless a group is connected by a strong sense of ethics or ideology, which quite frankly doesn't really exist in the West, it's highly unlikely that a commune will avoid falling into chaos. The residents of CHAZ had no goal in mind. They were just disenfranchised by the events prior to that point and turned to violence. The area became a breeding ground for homelessness, crime and bad faith actors that just wanted a bit of chaos as opposed to any real change. And that defines a problem with modern day anarchy in relation to chaos. Realistically, anarchy is not chaos. It's revolutionary. It aims to seize the means of production, abolish private property, give back to the working class, and of course restructure any form of established leadership. The negative stereotype that is immediately attached to anarchy due to its history of violence and of course incompetence in the modern day has pretty much dampened any chance of it working on a mass scale in modern society. Stemming all the way back to the French Revolution, anarchy has been used by opposing politicians as a negative buzzword to describe describe chaos and violence, simply due to the fact that the most prominent and iconic examples of anarchy have resulted in extreme violence, and that continues to this day. For example, nobody discusses the Middle Ages in regards to anarchy, where citizens lived without a system of economy or government, but unfortunately violence was rampant and breakcourt didn't exist, so maybe that's not the way to go. There is also the Rojava in the modern day, an autonomous region in northern Syria that emerged during the Syrian civil war. The power within the commune is decentralized and focuses on communal councils. Each of these institutions employs something named co-leadership, which essentially means each decision is decided by both a man and a woman, with women playing a key role in the military, which is incredibly progressive for Syria because, you know, they kind of They hate women. Although the Rojava isn't an anarchist society in the traditional sense, it utilizes many of its ideas to decent success, considering it isn't currently crashing and burning. But to be fair, the infrastructure of Syria is far less complicated than a Western country, so it's hard to reflect the success of the Rojava onto any Western country. I think it's safe to say that any real attempt to utilize anarchy within modern society is just doomed to fail. It seems that time and time again, whenever a group of people with anarchist ideals get into power, they immediately abuse that power to varying levels of chaos, and in the case of revolutionaries pushing towards anarchy, very often become the thing they sought to destroy. Power just simply corrupts motherfuckers, and regardless of the intention behind the revolution or anarchist commune, there are always going to be opposing opinions within a society. Even if we present a society where the working class are given more rights and liberation, people are going to inherently disagree with that, meaning in turn whoever is in power will simply need to enforce it in some way to reduce the risk of chaos. Anarchy is a difficult concept to discuss and analyze because realistically, outside of a few small insulated examples, we haven't actually seen anarchy work for a period of time that isn't cut short by the opposing political opinion. Anarchy could work, although its ability to work completely relies on what your opinion on the human psyche is. If you believe that humans are cooperative and caring in nature, anarchy can definitely work, and might even be the best way to run a society, although if you believe humans are inherently selfish and violent, anarchy will just simply never work on a mass scale without being presented upon the backdrop of tragedy or oppression. There is evidence to suggest that both of these opinions on the human psyche are true. For example, continuous research into primitive societies suggests that as an early species we were incredibly caring, thoughtful and cooperative, even creating specific special burial sites for the disabled. Although if we then look towards any form of society since that point in time, wars and violence have been rampant and haven't really ever stopped since. The only difference is now the United States government may be able to pop your head like a balloon using a satellite laser shot from space or something like that, which is probably misinformation. I literally just made that up. Could it be suggested that mass-scale violence has only really existed since the formation of established leadership? Yes, it could, although this concept can also very easily be explained by the development of technology utilized in warfare, as well as the simple development of society and how our original tribal instincts very quickly morphed into concepts like patriotism and nationalism. It's clear the system we currently politically and socially employ has its many faults, and I fear many of us traverse this earth with severe brain fog and hatred as a result, although it's very difficult to definitively suggest that anarchy would be the best political theory to replace what we currently have. Any attempt at protest and movements that push forwards anarchist ideals in a way that's beneficial seem to very quickly fizzle out and return to obscurity. An example is Occupy Wall Street. This mass-scale protest sought to give back to the 99%, and during its peak many prominent members formed a small-scale community in Zuccotti Park. This surprisingly didn't result in chaos like in the case of CHAZ, which is likely because this community wasn't full of Redditors and actually had a goal in mind. They instead ran a semi-functioning community that focused on moving forwards politically and educating society through the sharing of books. Instead of crashing and burning in an incredibly racist way like CHAZ, the movement just fizzled out. And this is because anarchy doesn't really mean anything, which is entirely by design. Anarchists are allowed to think differently, having different views on politics and society. This in turn means that any anarchist movement that begins to pick up steam, and often involves a large group of people, usually just will split into various smaller groups that focus on a section of the varied individual opinion any large anarchist group may have. This inherently decreases the influence and leverage these political groups have over the established authority. So do I think anarchy will ever be utilized on a mass scale within society? No, I don't. I just highly doubt a generation built on goy slop and Instagram reel gore thirst trap themed racism is ever going won't have the ability to overthrow the government. If that were to somehow happen, however, do I think an anarchist society would actually work? The optimist buried deep inside of my nihilistic British psyche wants to say yes. The human race can be beautiful, kind, and cooperative when they are forced to, like in the case of small-scale anarchy that is employed after natural disasters. Although, to be fair, this piece of art does exist, and the fact that an individual used their free will to make this completely destroys any hope of anarchy working in my eyes. Fret not, however, young one. Anarchy may not ever be utilized on a large scale, but we can see examples of anarchy all throughout society if we look hard enough. Whether it be the local crackhead stealing your lighter and promising he'll eventually give it back, or self-sustaining clubs and social groups that work without any leadership. Whether it be two unks scrapping outside the local supermarket avoiding the watchful gaze of the police, or aid groups that focus on helping those in need without the need for any profit or social climbing. Anarchy is everywhere, you just need to look hard enough. And thanks again to Fume for sponsoring this video. Click the link in the description to get your journey pack today.